The material from week 7, especially the readings by Clement and Michel de Certeau, took up elements of mystical, spiritual experiences as part of discussing blurred lines between silence and speech. Here, I seek to explore how the mystical experiences, tied up in syncope, can be an opening into queer lives as both a recognition of the repressive condition and refusal of absolute negativity. I'm interested in the ways in which syncope, as a mystical, spiritual experience, makes space for the queer encounter, which does not have a place in the world of appearance, while the presentation of these experiences in creative texts might also demonstrate de Certeau's tension between what cannot be said, yet must be said. The dominant doctrines of traditional monotheistic religion make little room for queerness, generally only acknowledging queer existence in order to forbid the unfolding of happy queer lives. While some queer folk, myself included to be transparent, respond by rejecting the notion of a spiritual world altogether in favor of atheism, there remains a tradition of queer mysticism that seek out moments of syncope, an attempt to say what must be said, yet cannot be said openly in the context of monotheistic faith. This presentation takes up 2 academic readings of mystical writing that focus on queer elements: Lydia Brown's analysis of Emily Bronte's poetry, and Hoda el-Shakry's discussion of Islamic short fiction, as ways of aligning with Clement's notion of syncope, before considering this queer mysticism as a refusal of Edelmanian absolute queer negativity. El-Shakry presents a detailed close reading of queer themes in 2 short stories by female Muslim authors, Rifat and Ez al-Din, where the women protagonists engage in spiritual sexual encounters with Jinn, who are explicitly given female forms, opening up spiritual worlds through queer sexuality. In the conclusion of her article, El-Shakry states that, quote, "I argue that the sensuous encounters with Jinn described in Rifat and Ez al-Din's stories introduce intimate knowledge practices that upend, on the one hand, the heteropatriarchal reproduction of the nuclear family, and on the other, gender-segregated piety," end quote. This intimate knowledge practice is one that relies on the failure of speech, and often a withdrawal from the physical body in the moment of ecstatic rupture, aligning with Clement's descriptions of syncope. In discussing Ez al-Din's story, Fairies of the Nile, El-Shakry points out that, quote, "The loss of her faculty of speech suggests that Zinat, the protagonist, comes to inhabit a new spiritual ontology, aligned with both the ascetic and embodied dimensions of Sufism. This spiritual ontology is further identified with spoken language being supplanted by music. Quote, "Music here functions as a mode of communication, tied to higher spiritual faculties and states, as in the case of Dakar. The emphasis on the unknown further links the sensuous world of sonic rhythm to the spiritual epistemes, particularly since Zinat learns to perceive these rhythms through her union with the Jinn," end quote. This would situate us in the 3rd circle of Clement's syncope, which she describes as ecstatic, aligning with the orgasmic nature of the encounters El-Shakry is describing, but also as beyond language, saying, quote, "More than any other sign, ecstasy reveals how impossible it is for language to domesticate it into a given order. Ineffable, it refuses to be said. It can be spoken of, often, only in counterpoint, in the negative, saying what it is not, and that it is not what it shows. A God, the void, nothing. It is a long internal pursuit destined to alternate between depressive desolation and sudden illumination," end quote. The encounters between women and female-bodied Jinn in the short stories is not a conversation. It is not a revelation of new doctrine. Rather, as Clement describes, it is the loss of faculties in a sensual encounter as a kind of illumination of a spiritual world that is not open to typical religious experiences. Here, it is appearing as the experience of queer intimacy as a form of spiritual fulfillment. I think it is important that El-Shakry finds this queer mystic encounter in short fiction, in texts that do not clearly define themselves as projects of queer theory or queer theology. By avoiding the potential for truth claims or stability that are more expected in explicitly philosophical disciplines, El-Shakry's authors are able to embrace a motion between the ecstatic mysticism of their stories and their implied queerness of spiritual worlds. This also puts these queer mystical tales in alignment with Clement's syncope, where she at times contrasts the philosophical approach with the creative or musical. Quote, The philosophical result of this delaying action often takes the name of freedom. But this delay chooses daylight and clarity. It is no longer a question of teetering in the darkness of night, but of avoiding losing the spirit. Passion is suspended indefinitely. It never recovers its original spark. In the movement of syncope, there is indeed a delay, but immediately, like the note in musical syncopation, this delay rushes into anticipation. The philosophical act rushes nothing. On the contrary, it curbs, slows down. It suspends without hope of return." End quote. It is with this idea of motion that I will move to my second example, Lydia Brown's analysis of Emily Bronte's poetry. Brown positions the sense of motion in Bronte's poetry as supporting the move outside of the world, a motion that seems to align with syncope. Writing specifically about the poem I Am Happiest When Most Away, Brown says, quote, "Readers move through with little phonetic grounding, but with undulating rhythmic momentum, like breathing, rushing and finishing, intangible but full of motion, just like this poem's fleeting eye. It is awayness, motion, the act of being away, which constitutes the I am." End quote. Here, Brown points to the ways that language and structure in the poem itself assist the reader in mirroring the speaker's journey and motion through the breath. While the loss of subjective grounding may point to syncope in the sense of a faint, the motion of the text itself also aligns with syncopation as a musical strategy. The awayness, and the motion implied in it, is constructed around the notion of a female divine, which the speaker of the poet is able to reunite with through the movement beyond their body. In discussing stars, Brown points us to the connection between Bronte's mysticism and a more heteronormative reading of Christian mysticism. Quote, "The language here is idealistic, verging on orgasmic, a feminist reimagining as the Christian mystic spiritual euphoria as sexual euphoria, this time between a presumably female speaker and a female deity, rather than a speaker and a masculine god. The room then, both bedroom and mind, resonates as a feminine sanctuary, a micro and macro life where spiritual and sexual selves are fulfilled by feminized energy." End quote. The syncope of the mystical encounter, the suspension between the world of appearance and the possibly imagined divine realm, holds the space for the passion that cannot be entirely fulfilled, but is given a voice and a kind of existence through the mystical encounter. Bronte's poetry is not a philosophical argument for the legitimacy of the queer subject. In fact, I think it is problematic to definitively claim Emily Bronte as queer given her blurriness in the historical record. But in these syncopated poems, there is a sense of the possibility or potentiality of queerness, which can be moved through without stagnating into a singular truth claim. While I think the queer mysticism of these texts maps quite smoothly onto the notion of syncope, their relationship to de Certeau's Glossolalias is less neat, but perhaps more interesting. The texts written by Edelman and Bronte are clearly not glossolalic in the primary sense of being like language without actually being a language. The authors are writing in Arabic and English respectively, and are accessible to readers of those languages. However, in their queerness, I suggest that they move between the must be said and cannot be said of de Certeau's vocal utopias. For both authors, their cultural and religious contexts prevented unambiguous expressions of queer sexuality in mundane life. Queerness, as an everyday practice, became unspeakable. It is the cannot be said, both because of the context that the authors are working in, and also perhaps because of a lack of language available to these writers to voice queerness. Yet, the academic works of Brown and Shakry are able to identify the queer mystical encounter in the syncope experienced by the speaker or narrator of these respective texts. Queerness, then, is the thing that must be said. It is a part of the spiritual world opened up by the literary work, but cannot be generally accessed by typical language, and rather are experienced in the lapse and movement between the mystical experience and the normative world of everyday life. So while these expressions of queer mystical sexuality are clearly not glossolalic, I do think that the tension that de Certeau identifies as a part of glossolalic expression are at work in the way that these queer mysticisms are functioning as a way of expressing what otherwise is unspeakable in a given cultural or religious context. The navigation of the must be said and cannot be said brings me to the final consideration of this discussion, which is the response to queer negativity. Negativity runs through both Clement and Certeau, but it also has a central role in contemporary queer theory, demonstrated at its most extreme in the works of Lee Edelman, whose 2004 book, No Future, brought queer negativity to the forefront of theoretical discussion, while also gathering significant backlash, which has fueled his doubling down in 2021's Bad Education, which I'll quote from the conclusion of here. Quote, "While important work remains to be done on the social, historical, and material conditions experienced by queer beings, I have argued for the central importance of the cut that puts queerness outside of being, and then literalizes the outside of being in those construed as queer. Thus, the more queer theory theorizes queerness, the less it substantializes queers." End quote. So drawing on the language of syncope and the cannot but must be said, I suggest that queer mystics can be read as a way of engaging with the negativity of queer life, the impossibility of speaking queer existence in oppressive conditions. The mystical encounter moves the authors beyond the mores of typical society, making queer expression acceptable insofar as it is not of this world. The need to move beyond the world of appearance aligns with the core ideas of queer pessimism set out by Edelman. But it is in this moment of mystical or static syncope that queerness is expressed and resituated in the world through an expression that is not loudly queer, as it might be defined today, but also breaks the perceived silence of queer folk in the historical or religious context. It is a way of substantializing queers, to borrow Edelman's language, as a part of a spiritual cosmology that moves beyond a world of appearance. The reading of Clement and de Certeau that I have come to in thinking about how their ideas might appear in queer mysticism is a reading that considers how these moments of lapse and failure of language can be taken up as a part of political struggle, through the reassertion of queer life found in ambiguously queer writing of the past. These readings, despite their insufficiency to prove any of the authors are definitively queer, do substantialize the possibility of queer life and queer cosmologies being theorized, even within religious systems that are generally assumed to exclude these ways of being. The speakers and narrators of Jinn and Bronte can be theorized as queer, acknowledging both the negativity or absence of queer life and the possibility of experiencing queer fulfillment through the mystical encounter, the moment of syncope. Thank you.